The morning sun cast long shadows across Lomé's bustling markets, but beneath the surface of everyday life, something dangerous was stirring. Kofi Mensah, a university student turned activist, clutched his phone tightly as he read the latest reports from the northern regions. Government forces had opened fire on peaceful protesters in Kara, leaving 12 people dead and dozens wounded. The images flooding social media showed bloodied streets and crying mothers holding photographs of their children. President FAURE Gnassinggbé sat in his heavily guarded palace, completely unaware that his iron grip on power was beginning to slip. For 15 years he had ruled Togo with the same authoritarian methods his father had used for 38 years before him. The Gnassinggbé dynasty had controlled the small West African nation for over half a century, treating it like their personal kingdom. Opposition voices were silenced, journalists disappeared, and anyone who dared speak against the regime faced imprisonment or worse. But times were changing. Social media had given the people a voice that couldn't be easily silenced. Young Togolese were organizing through encrypted messaging apps, sharing videos of government brutality, and coordinating protests across the country. The movement had no single leader, which made it impossible for Gnassinggbé's security forces to crush by simply arresting a few key figures. In the military barracks of Lomé, Colonel Yakuba Ouattara stared at the reports crossing his desk with growing concern. As one of the few honest officers left in the Togolese armed forces, he had watched his country slide deeper into corruption and violence. His own soldiers were being ordered to fire on unarmed civilians, and many were refusing. The military, once Gnassinggbé's most reliable tool of oppression, was beginning to fracture. The international community was finally paying attention too. After years of turning a blind eye to the human rights abuses in Togo, foreign governments were imposing sanctions and cutting off aid. The French government, Togo's former colonial power and longtime supporter of the Gnassinggbé regime, had quietly begun distancing itself from the president. Intelligence reports suggested that even some of Faure's closest allies were beginning to explore their options for a post-Gnassinggbé future. Dr. Brigitte Adjamagbo Johnson, a prominent opposition leader who had spent years fighting the regime, through legal means, sensed that the tide was finally turning. Her coalition of democratic forces had been organizing peaceful resistance for decades, often facing brutal crackdowns. But now, for the first time, she could see real fear in the eyes of government officials. The protests were spreading faster than the security forces could contain them, and international pressure was mounting. In the presidential palace, Gnassinggbé's advisors painted an increasingly grim picture during their daily briefings. The economy was collapsing under the weight of sanctions and corruption. Key military commanders were no longer returning his calls. Even his own Republican Party was quietly discussing succession plans. The president, however, remained defiant, convinced that his security apparatus would ultimately protect him as it always had. The spark that would ignite the final revolution came from an unexpected source. Aminata Traoré, a market vendor and mother of 3, had watched government soldiers beat her teenage son unconscious during a routine checkpoint search. The video of the incident, captured by a bystander and shared online, went viral within hours. Aminata's tearful plea for justice resonated with millions of Togolese who had suffered similar injustices under the regime. Within days, massive crowds were gathering in cities across Togo, demanding not just justice for Aminata's son, but the complete removal of the Gnassinggbé government. The protests were peaceful but determined, with participants ranging from students and professionals to farmers and traders. Even some government workers quietly joined the demonstrations, risking their jobs and freedom. The president's response was predictably brutal. He declared a state of emergency and ordered the military to clear the streets by any means necessary. But something unprecedented happened. Significant portions of the military refused to obey. Junior officers, inspired by the courage of the protesters and disgusted by years of corruption, began openly defying their commanders. Some units even joined the demonstrations, providing protection for the civilian protesters. As news of the military's rebellion reached the presidential palace, panic began to set in among Gnassinggbé's inner circle, For the first time in decades, the carefully constructed system of fear and control that had kept the dynasty in power was crumbling. The president called emergency meetings with his security chiefs, but found that many were no longer answering his summons. Some had already fled the country, while others were quietly negotiating with opposition leaders. The international media descended on Lomé, broadcasting images of the growing protests to the world. Social media platforms were flooded with videos showing peaceful protesters facing down riot police, military units switching sides, and government buildings being abandoned by their occupants. The hashtag TOGO uprising began trending globally, bringing unprecedented attention to the small West African nation's struggle for freedom. The presidential palace, once a symbol of unshakable power, had become a fortress under siege. FAURE Gnassinggbé paced nervously through the marble halls where his father had once walked with absolute confidence. Outside the heavily fortified gates, the sound of chanting crowds grew louder each day. "FAURE must go! FAURE must go!" The rhythmic calls echoed through the compound, penetrating even the soundproofed walls of his private office. Colonel Ouattara had made his decision 3 days earlier when he received orders to deploy tanks against the civilian protesters. Instead of following commands, he had quietly reached out to other military commanders who shared his concerns about the direction their country was heading. The response was overwhelming. Unit after unit pledged to support the people rather than the president. By dawn, nearly half of the Togolese military had effectively mutinied. The colonel's phone buzzed constantly with reports from across the nation. In Sokodé, an entire garrison had marched out to join the protesters, their rifles held high in solidarity. In Atakpame, soldiers were distributing food and water to demonstrators who had been camped in the main square for days. Most shocking of all, the elite Republican Guard, hand-picked for their loyalty to the Gnassinggbé family, was showing signs of fracturing. Inside the palace, chaos reigned as government ministers and advisors fled in increasing numbers. The Minister of Defense had disappeared overnight, reportedly boarding a private jet to Paris with his family and several suitcases of cash. The head of the secret police, once feared throughout the country, was found dead in his office. Apparently a suicide, though rumors suggested he had been eliminated by his own subordinates who wanted to avoid war crimes charges. President Gnassinggbé summoned his remaining loyal commanders for an emergency meeting in the palace's war room. The gathering was smaller than he had expected. Only a handful of officers showed up, and even they looked uncomfortable. General Asani Tijani, the longest-serving member of the President's Security Council, delivered the devastating news. "Mr. President, we estimate that less than 30% of our forces remain loyal. The rest have either joined the rebellion or returned to their barracks and declared neutrality." The president's response was a mixture of rage and desperation. He threatened court-martials, executions, and the complete destruction of any military unit that dared to defy him. But his words rang hollow in the nearly empty room. Everyone present knew that his power to carry out such threats was rapidly evaporating. The very guards standing at the doors of the war room exchanged nervous glances, wondering if they should continue protecting a man whose government was clearly collapsing. Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson seized the moment to make a bold move. Leading a delegation of opposition leaders, civil society activists, and religious figures, she marched directly to the palace gates and demanded to speak with the president. The crowd of supporters behind her stretched for blocks, creating a sea of people that completely surrounded the presidential compound. The symbolism was powerful. The people of Togo had literally encircled the seat of power that had oppressed them for so long. The palace guards, young soldiers who had grown up hearing stories of the Gnassinggbé family's brutality, faced an impossible choice. Their orders were to prevent anyone from entering the grounds, but the crowd was peaceful and included many people they recognized from their own neighborhoods. Some guards quietly stepped aside, allowing the opposition delegation to approach the main entrance. Others laid down their weapons and joined the protesters, much to the shock of their commanding officers. International pressure intensified as world leaders finally found their voices. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session to discuss the crisis in Togo. The African Union, which had remained silent during decades of Gnassinggbé rule, suddenly issued strongly worded statements calling for immediate democratic reforms. Most importantly, France announced the immediate suspension of all military aid to the Togolese government and called for President Gnassingbé to step down in the interests of peace and stability. Inside the palace, Gnassingbé's wife and children were secretly evacuating. Under cover of darkness, they were driven to a private airfield outside Lomé, where a chartered plane waited to take them to safety in Europe. The president's family had always maintained foreign residences and bank accounts as insurance policies, never fully trusting that their grip on power would last forever. Now those preparations were proving wise as the dynasty's half-century rule crumbled around them. The president's closest remaining advisor, his cousin and longtime confidant, Robert Gnassingbé, finally delivered the truth that everyone else had been afraid to speak. "FAURE, it's over. The military won't fight for us anymore. The people are united against us. Even our international supporters have abandoned us. You need to consider your options while you still have some." But FAURE Gnassingbé was not ready to accept defeat. Despite everything, he still believed that his security forces would eventually restore order and that the international community would ultimately support stability over democracy. He had watched other African dictators weather similar crises through brutal crackdowns and foreign intervention. In his mind, this was just another challenge to be overcome through force and determination. The president's delusion became clear when he ordered his remaining loyal units to prepare for a final assault on the protesters surrounding the palace. The plan was to break the siege through overwhelming violence, hoping that once the crowds were dispersed, normal order could be restored. However, when the orders were transmitted to military commanders, something unprecedented happened. They were simply ignored. Colonel Ouattara, now effectively leading the rebellious military units, made a decision that would change everything. He ordered his forces to establish a protective perimeter around the peaceful protesters, making it clear that any attempt to harm civilians would be met with military resistance. For the first time in Togo's history, the army was protecting the people from their own government rather than the other way around. As night fell over Lomé, the presidential palace stood isolated and surrounded, its occupant growing more desperate with each passing hour. The sounds of celebration could be heard from the crowds outside as news spread that the military had officially switched sides. FAURE Gnassingbé, the man who had ruled with absolute power just days earlier, was now effectively a prisoner in his own palace, with only a handful of loyal guards standing between him and the justice that millions of his people demanded. The betrayal came from where FAURE Gnassingbé least expected it, from within his own family. His younger brother Kapacha, who had served as Minister of Defense until his arrest in 2009 for allegedly plotting a coup, had been secretly released from prison 3 days earlier. The prison guards, no longer loyal to the regime, had simply opened his cell and walked away. Now Kapacha stood in the palace courtyard, addressing the remaining government officials and security personnel. "My fellow Togolese," Kapacha announced, his voice carrying across the compound through hastily assembled loudspeakers. "For too long, our family has brought shame upon this nation. I have spent years in prison thinking about the mistakes we made, the people we hurt, the opportunities we wasted. Today, I stand with the people of Togo in demanding an end to this dynasty that has caused so much suffering." The psychological impact of Kapacha's words was devastating. If the president's own brother was calling for his removal, what hope did the regime have of survival? The remaining palace guards began laying down their weapons and removing their uniforms. Government ministers who had hesitated to abandon their posts now rushed to distance themselves from the collapsing administration. Colonel Ouattara received reports throughout the morning that painted a picture of total governmental collapse. The Treasury building had been evacuated after employees discovered that the national bank accounts had been mysteriously emptied. Apparently, high-ranking officials had been secretly transferring public funds to foreign accounts for months. The Supreme Court had issued a statement declaring that it would no longer recognize the authority of the Gnassingbé government. Even the state television station had been taken over by protesters who were now broadcasting opposition messages. In the northern city of Dapaong, Captain Kojo Agbeko made a discovery that would provide the final nail in the regime's coffin. While searching through abandoned government offices, his unit uncovered a cache of documents detailing systematic human rights abuses dating back decades. The files contained photographs, victim testimonies, and detailed records of torture sessions conducted in secret detention centers. Most damaging of all were audio recordings of President Gnassingbé personally ordering the elimination of political opponents. Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson, who had maintained her vigil outside the palace gates, received a call that changed everything. The International Criminal Court in The Hague had issued an arrest warrant for FAURE Gnassingbé based on evidence of crimes against humanity. The warrant had been fast-tracked due to the urgency of the situation and the overwhelming evidence provided by military defectors and former government officials seeking to save themselves. The news of the arrest warrant spread through the crowd like wildfire. Protesters who had maintained their peaceful discipline for days began calling for immediate justice. Some shouted for the president to be dragged from his palace and tried on the spot. However, Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson and other opposition leaders worked tirelessly to maintain order, knowing that any violence could discredit their movement and potentially invite foreign intervention. Inside the palace, President Gnassingbé was rapidly running out of options. His communications with the outside world had been cut off as telecommunications workers joined the general strike that was paralyzing the country. The palace's internet connection had been severed, and even the landline phones were no longer functioning. He was effectively isolated from his remaining supporters and unable to coordinate any kind of counterattack. The president's final desperate gambit was to reach out to foreign mercenaries. Through intermediaries, he attempted to contact private military companies that had previously worked with African dictators facing similar situations. However, his requests for help were met with silence or outright refusal. The international community's swift condemnation of his regime had made it too risky for even the most unscrupulous mercenary groups to get involved. General Tijani, the last high-ranking military officer still nominally loyal to Gnassingbé, delivered the final blow. In a private meeting with the president, he revealed that he had been in secret negotiations with Colonel Ouattara and the rebel military commanders. "Mr. President," he said quietly, "I've been offered immunity from prosecution if I help ensure a peaceful transition. Your personal guard unit has agreed to stand down in exchange for safe passage out of the country. You have perhaps 6 hours before this palace is completely surrounded by military units under opposition control." The reality of his situation finally hit FAURE Gnassingbé like a physical blow. The man who had believed himself untouchable, who had inherited what he thought was an unshakable throne, suddenly understood that his reign was over. His father's carefully constructed system of control had completely collapsed, leaving him defenseless against the will of his own people. Panic set in as the president realized that his usual escape routes had been cut off. The international airports were under opposition control. His personal helicopter had been grounded by mutinous pilots. Even his yacht, moored in Lomé's port, was surrounded by dock workers who had joined the general strike. For the first time in his life, FAURE Gnassingbé was trapped with no way out. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the palace corridors. Colonel Ouattara's forces were moving into position around the building, preparing for the final phase of their operation. The colonel had given explicit instructions that the president was to be taken alive and handed over to proper authorities. There would be no summary justice or vigilante violence that could tarnish Togo's democratic transition. As darkness fell, President Gnassingbé sat alone in his office, staring at the photographs of his father that lined the walls. Gnassingbé Eyadema had ruled Togo with an iron fist for nearly 4 decades, surviving numerous coup attempts and outlasting many of his contemporaries in other African nations. But even he could not have anticipated that his son's downfall would come not from foreign invasion or military coup, but from his own people rising up with such unified determination. The final irony was not lost on the president, as he heard the sound of boots marching through his palace corridors. The very building that had been designed as a fortress to protect the ruling family from their people had become a prison, trapping him inside while justice finally caught up with the Gnassingbé dynasty. The moment that would define Togo's future arrived at exactly 3:47 a.m. on a moonless Wednesday morning. Colonel Uatara led a carefully selected unit of soldiers through the palace's main entrance, their footsteps echoing through marble hallways that had witnessed decades of authoritarian rule. The colonel had chosen his men carefully, soldiers who were known for their discipline and professionalism, men who could be trusted to carry out this historic arrest without violence or revenge. President FAURE Gnassingbé sat behind his massive, mahogany desk, wearing the same suit he had put on the previous morning when his world had still made sense. He had spent the last few hours destroying documents and trying unsuccessfully to contact foreign allies who might offer him sanctuary. The ornate presidential office, with its gold-trimmed furniture and portraits of African leaders, seemed to mock him now as his final moments in power ticked away. The door opened without ceremony. Colonel Uatara entered first, followed by 6 soldiers and a civilian, a magistrate who had volunteered to ensure that the arrest followed proper legal procedures despite the extraordinary circumstances. The president looked up from his desk with a mixture of defiance and resignation. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the room, the dictator who had ruled through fear, and the soldier who had chosen conscience over orders. "Mr. Gnassingbé," Colonel Uatara said formally, "by the authority granted to me by the people of Togo, and in accordance with the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, I am placing you under arrest for crimes against humanity." His voice was steady and professional, betraying none of the emotion he felt at this historic moment. The president's response surprised everyone in the room. Instead of the expected anger or desperate pleas, FAURE Gnassingbé simply asked, "Will you allow me to call my children?" It was the first time in days that he had spoken with the voice of a father rather than a dictator. Colonel Uatara nodded and stepped aside as Gnassingbé picked up a satellite phone that had been his last remaining connection to the outside world. The conversation was brief and heartbreaking. Speaking in French to his daughter studying in Switzerland, the president's voice cracked as he told her that he loved her and that she should not attempt to return to Togo. "Take care of your mother and your brothers," he whispered into the phone. "Remember that despite everything, I tried to serve our country the best way I knew how." The soldiers in the room shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed the human side of a man they had been taught to view as a monster. As Gnassingbé was handcuffed with restraints that seemed absurdly heavy for a man who suddenly looked much older than his 58 years, news of the arrest spread instantly through the crowd outside. The roar that went up from the thousands of protesters was unlike anything Lomé had ever heard, a sound of pure joy mixed with relief and vindication. People embraced strangers, danced in the streets, and sang traditional songs that had been banned during the darkest years of the dictatorship. Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson, who had maintained her vigil outside the palace gates, felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the presidential motorcade, now surrounded by opposition supporters rather than secret police, slowly make its way through the crowd. This was the moment she had dreamed of during 20 years of opposition struggle through imprisonment, exile, and constant threats. The dictator who had terrorized their nation was finally being held accountable. The route to the courthouse where Gnassingbé would be formally processed had been carefully planned to avoid potential flashpoints of violence. However, the colonel had underestimated the speed with which news would spread through social media. By the time the convoy reached the city center, tens of thousands of people lined the streets. Some threw flowers at the vehicles, others held up photographs of family, members who had died under the regime. Many simply stood in silent witness to history. At the courthouse, an extraordinary scene unfolded as representatives from international human rights organizations, foreign diplomats, and local civil society groups gathered to ensure that proper procedures were followed. The International Criminal Court had dispatched a special prosecutor to oversee the initial proceedings and coordinate Gnassingbé's eventual transfer to The Hague for trial. The world was watching, and everyone involved understood the importance of doing everything by the book. Former President Gnassingbé appeared smaller and more fragile as he was led into the courthouse. Gone was the swagger and arrogance that had characterized his public appearances for 15 years. In its place was a broken man who seemed to finally understand the magnitude of suffering he had caused. The formal reading of charges took nearly an hour. A litany of murders, tortures, disappearances, and systematic human rights abuses that had terrorized the nation for decades. The most emotional moment came when Aminata Traoré, the market vendor whose son's beating had sparked the final uprising, was allowed to address the court. She spoke simply and directly, her words carrying the pain of millions of Togolese who had suffered under the regime. "Today is not about revenge," she said, looking directly at the former president. "Today is about justice. Today is about making sure that no other mother has to watch her child suffer as mine did." Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued into the dawn hours. For the first time in decades, people could speak freely about their government without fear. Newspapers, that had been censored for years, published special editions with headlines they had only dreamed of writing. Radio stations played songs that had been banned, and television broadcasts showed footage of the brutal crackdowns that had been hidden from the public for so long. Colonel Ouattara, now effectively the leader of Togo's transitional military government, addressed the nation on live television. He announced that elections would be held within 6 months, that all political prisoners would be released immediately, and that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be established to help the country heal from decades of authoritarian rule. Most importantly, he pledged that the military would return to its barracks and would never again be used to oppress the Togolese people. The international response was swift and overwhelmingly positive. Countries that had imposed sanctions began discussing aid packages to help Togo transition to democracy. The African Union praised the peaceful nature of the transition and held it up as a model for other nations struggling with authoritarian rule. Even France, which had supported the Gnassingbé dynasty for decades, announced a new partnership with Democratic Togo. As the sun rose over Lomé on that historic morning, FAURE Gnassingbé sat in a holding cell awaiting transfer to international custody. The man who had woken up the previous day as an absolute ruler would soon be just another defendant in an international criminal court. The Gnassingbé dynasty that had dominated Togo for 57 years was finally over, and the long-awaited dawn of freedom had begun. The transformation of Togo began immediately after FAURE Gnassingbe's arrest, as if the entire country had been holding its breath for decades and could finally exhale. In the days following the dictator's capture, scenes of joy and liberation played out across the nation as people discovered what it felt like to live without fear, for the first time in their lives. In the northern city of Kara, where government soldiers had fired on protesters just weeks earlier, former enemies embraced each other in the town square. Soldiers who had once terrorized civilians were now helping to rebuild the very communities they had damaged. Captain Agbeko, the young officer who had discovered the regime's secret torture documents, organized his unit to provide security for peaceful demonstrations and to help distribute food to families whose breadwinners had been imprisoned by the previous government. The release of political prisoners became a daily celebration as families were reunited with loved ones they had not seen for years. Koko Tsikata, a journalist who had spent 8 years in prison for writing articles critical of the government, emerged blinking into the sunlight to find his daughter, who had been 7 when he was arrested, now a teenager, leading student. Protests. His first words upon release were simple but powerful. The truth can never be imprisoned forever. Dr. Ajimagbo Johnson found herself overwhelmed by the speed of change. Her coalition of democratic forces, which had operated as an underground resistance movement for decades, suddenly needed to transform itself into a legitimate political party preparing for elections. Opposition leaders who had spent years in exile began returning to Togo, bringing with them new ideas and international connections that would help rebuild the nation. The international community responded with unprecedented support for Togo's democratic transition. The United Nations established a special office in Lomé to coordinate humanitarian aid and election monitoring. The World Bank announced a $1 billion reconstruction package to help rebuild the country's infrastructure, which had been neglected during decades of corrupt rule. European universities offered scholarships to young Togolese students who wanted to study abroad and return with skills to help their nation develop. Perhaps most importantly, the truth about the Gnassingbé regime's crimes began to emerge in full. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by respected religious leaders and human rights activists, began collecting testimony from victims and their families. The stories were heartbreaking but necessary. Tales of midnight arrests, torture chambers, and mass graves that the dictatorial government had tried to hide from the world. One of the most shocking revelations came from Colonel Ouattara's investigation into the regime's financial crimes. Government accountants, finally free to speak honestly, revealed that the Gnassingbé family had stolen an estimated $3 billion from the Togolese treasury over the decades of their rule. This money, enough to build hospitals, schools, and roads throughout the country, had instead been funneled into foreign bank accounts and luxury properties around the world. The colonel, now serving as interim president, made recovering these stolen assets a top priority. Working with international law enforcement agencies, his government began the complex process of tracking down and freezing the Gnassingbé family's foreign holdings. Several European banks found themselves under investigation for knowingly facilitating money laundering by the corrupt regime. Meanwhile, in The Hague, former President Gnassingbé's trial preparations were beginning. The International Criminal Court had assembled a team of prosecutors from around the world to ensure that justice would be thorough and fair. Evidence was mounting daily as more witnesses came forward, no longer afraid to speak the truth about what they had witnessed during the dark years of dictatorship. The psychological transformation of Togolese society was perhaps even more remarkable than the political changes. People who had lived in fear for generations were learning to express themselves freely. Satirical comedians emerged from hiding to perform shows mocking the fallen regime. Artists painted murals celebrating freedom on walls that had once displayed only government propaganda. Musicians composed songs about liberation that played on radio stations that had previously only broadcast approved content. Schools across the country began teaching honest history for the first time in decades. Children learned about the heroes who had resisted the dictatorship, the journalists who had died for telling the truth, and the ordinary citizens who had shown extraordinary courage in the face of oppression. Textbooks that had glorified the Gnassingbé dynasty were replaced with materials that emphasized human rights, democracy, and critical thinking. The economic revival began slowly but steadily. Foreign investors who had avoided Togo due to its reputation for corruption and instability began showing interest in the country's potential. The port of Lomé, which had been mismanaged and used primarily for smuggling operations by the previous regime, was redesigned to serve as a legitimate hub for West African trade. Young entrepreneurs, no longer forced to pay bribes to corrupt officials, started small businesses that created jobs and brought new energy to their communities. Religious leaders, who had been forced to remain silent during the dictatorship, found their voices again. Churches, mosques, and traditional religious centers became spaces for community healing and planning for the future. Interfaith dialogue, which had been suppressed by the regime's divide and rule tactics, flourished as people of different backgrounds worked together to rebuild their nation. The role of women in Togo's transformation was particularly significant. Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson became a symbol of courage and perseverance for women across Africa who were fighting their own battles against authoritarian rule. Market women like Aminata Traoré, who had sparked the final uprising, found themselves elevated to positions of respect and influence in their communities. For the first time, there was serious discussion about ensuring significant female representation in the upcoming parliament. Technology played a crucial role in maintaining the momentum of change. Young Togolese who had used social media to organize the revolution now used the same platforms to coordinate reconstruction efforts and ensure transparency in government. Live streaming of government meetings became routine, making it impossible for officials to make decisions in secret or return to the corrupt practices of the past. The international media, which had largely ignored Togo during its decades of suffering, now celebrated the country as a beacon of hope for democratic change. In Africa, documentary filmmakers arrived to record the testimonies of survivors and witnesses. Academic researchers came to study how a seemingly entrenched dictatorship could be brought down through peaceful popular uprising combined with military defection. As preparations for the promised elections intensified, political parties that had operated in secret for decades began campaigning openly. The atmosphere was electric with possibility, as candidates debated policy issues rather than simply competing for the favor of a dictator. Voter registration drives attracted millions of citizens who had never before had the chance to choose their leaders in free and fair elections. 6 months after FAURE Gnassingbe's arrest, Togo held its first truly free and democratic elections in over half a century. The campaign period had been unlike anything the country had ever experienced, with multiple candidates from various parties traveling freely across the nation, holding rallies without fear of government interference, and debating policy issues on live television broadcasts that reached every corner of the country. Dr. Brigitte Ajamagbo Johnson stood before a crowd of 50,000 supporters in Lomé's Central Stadium on the final day of campaigning. Her voice carried clearly across the packed venue as she spoke about the future she envisioned for Togo, a future built on justice, equality, and sustainable development. The crowd included people from every ethnic group, social class, and region of the country, united in their desire to build something better from the ashes of dictatorship. The election itself was a celebration of democracy that brought international observers from around the world. Former victims of the Gnassingbe regime served as poll workers, ensuring that the same people who had suffered under authoritarian rule would help guarantee the integrity of the democratic process. Long lines of voters stretched outside polling stations from dawn to dusk, with people waiting patiently for hours just to cast their ballots in freedom. Colonel Ouattara, who had overseen the transition government with remarkable restraint and wisdom, chose not to run for president despite pressure from many supporters. Instead, he announced his intention to retire from politics and return to his role as a professional military officer. "The army belongs in the barracks, not in the presidential palace," he declared in his final address as interim president. His decision to voluntarily give up power earned him respect across Africa and around the world. When the election results were announced 3 days later, Dr. Ajamagbo Johnson had won a decisive victory with 57% of the vote. At 62 years old, after decades of struggle against authoritarian rule, she would become Togo's first female president and the leader who would guide the nation's democratic consolidation. Her victory speech emphasized reconciliation and healing, rather than revenge against former regime supporters. The inauguration ceremony was held outdoors in the same square where protesters had gathered to demand Gnassingbe's removal. International delegations from dozens of countries attended, including several African presidents who had themselves transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy. The symbolic power of the moment was not lost on anyone. The space that had once been used for pro-government rallies was now hosting the peaceful transfer of power to a democratically elected leader. President Ajamagbo Johnson's inaugural address resonated far beyond Togo's borders. She spoke about the responsibility that comes with freedom, the hard work required to build democratic institutions, and the importance of never forgetting the lessons learned during the dark decades of dictatorship. "We have proven that no tyrant is too powerful, no system of oppression too entrenched when people unite with courage and determination," she declared to thunderous applause. One of her first acts as president was to establish a special prosecutor's office dedicated to recovering the billions of dollars stolen by the previous regime. Working with international partners, the new government had already begun freezing assets hidden in foreign banks and luxury properties owned by Gnassingbe family members around the world. These recovered funds would be used to build the schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that Togo desperately needed. The transformation of Togo's institutions proceeded rapidly under the new government. The secret police apparatus was completely dismantled and replaced with a professional law enforcement system focused on protecting citizens rather than intimidating them. The military underwent comprehensive reforms, with human rights training becoming mandatory for all officers, and a new code of conduct that explicitly prohibited political involvement. Aminata Traoré, the market vendor whose son's beating had sparked the revolution, found herself appointed to the new National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her role was to help communities across the country heal from decades of trauma, while ensuring that the stories of victims were properly documented and remembered. The Commission's work became a model for other countries emerging from authoritarian rule. The international community's support for Togo's transition proved crucial to its success. The European Union announced a comprehensive aid package focused on education and healthcare. China offered to build new roads and bridges to connect remote areas to the national economy. American universities established exchange programs to help train a new generation of Togolese professionals in fields ranging from engineering to public administration. Perhaps most remarkably, Togo began attracting investment from its own diaspora. Togolese professionals who had fled the country during the dictatorship started returning home, bringing capital, expertise, and international connections that helped accelerate the nation's development. Successful businesses emerged in technology, agriculture, and manufacturing as entrepreneurs no longer had to worry about arbitrary government interference or demands for bribes. The trial of FAURE GNASSINGBÉ at the International Criminal Court became a global symbol of accountability for human rights abuses. The proceedings, which were broadcast live throughout Togo, provided a detailed record of the regime's crimes while giving victims and their families a chance to see justice served. The former president was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity, sending a clear message to dictators everywhere that impunity was no longer guaranteed. Education reform became a cornerstone of the new Togo's development strategy. Schools that had previously taught only propaganda and rote memorization were transformed into centers of critical thinking and creativity. Free primary education was guaranteed for all children, and new technical institutes were established to provide skills training for young people entering the job market. Literacy rates, which had stagnated under the previous regime, began rising dramatically. The cultural renaissance that followed democratization was extraordinary to witness. Musicians who had been forced to sing praise songs for the dictator now composed symphonies celebrating freedom. Writers who had faced imprisonment for their work published novels and poetry that explored themes of resistance, hope, and national identity. Traditional festivals that had been suppressed or co-opted by the regime were revived and celebrated with genuine joy. Women's rights, which had been systematically undermined during the dictatorship, became a central focus of the new government. President Ajimagbo Johnson appointed women to key cabinet positions and pushed through legislation guaranteeing equal access to education and employment opportunities. Domestic violence, which had been ignored by previous authorities, was criminalized and prosecuted vigorously. The environmental restoration of Togo became another priority, as the new government discovered the extent of ecological damage caused by decades of corrupt resource extraction. Reforestation programs began in areas where forests had been illegally harvested by cronies of the previous regime. National parks that had been used as private hunting grounds for government officials were restored and opened to the public. 5 years after the fall of the Gnassingbé dynasty, Togo had become a beacon of hope for democratic movements across Africa and beyond. Delegations from other countries struggling with authoritarian rule visited Lomé to study how the transition had been accomplished so successfully. The peaceful nature of the change, the inclusive character of the new government, and the remarkable economic progress achieved in such a short time made Togo a model for democratic transformation. The children who had grown up under dictatorship were now teenagers learning about democracy not just in textbooks, but through active participation in student government and youth organizations. They could hardly imagine the fear that had once paralyzed their parents and older siblings. For them, freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and the right to choose their leaders were natural and unquestionable rights. As President Ajimagbo Johnson prepared for her re-election campaign, polls showed that an overwhelming majority of Togolese approved of the direction their country was heading. Crime rates had fallen, the economy was growing, and most importantly, people felt hope for the future in a way they had not experienced for generations. The woman who had spent decades fighting against tyranny was now leading her nation toward a bright and democratic future that once seemed impossible to imagine.